Hello. Buon pomeriggio, grazie a tutti, thank you all for being here. Just a little bit of housekeeping, un po' di note di servizio, because when I pitched this to the organizers, I said, sure, I'll make it bilingual, and now I kind of, think that promise may have been a bit much. But anyway, anche in italiano, questo deve essere un evento bilingue, ma posso chiedere quanti di voi parlano solo italiano e non riuscirebbero a seguire un discorso in inglese? Magari non perfettamente, ma non riuscirebbero a seguire. Ok, allora il mio consiglio a voi è magari di mettere, e vedo una signora già organizzatissima, perciò di avere col QR code il servizio di traduzione. For all the other Italians who do speak English well, but sometimes you think you didn't catch something, please raise your hand, because the whole point of my speech and all the work I'm doing around language is that we shouldn't be embarrassed about not being fluent and perfect English speakers if we're not native English speakers. So for all the other Italians who want to listen to me but are not necessarily maybe going to catch everything, if there's ever anything that you don't get, raise your hand and I will try to speak in Italian as well. And to all the non-Italian English speakers, this is about language, so patience will be a key asset. And just another little bit of housekeeping. How many people here are second language English or third language English? I suppose if it's ever been an issue for you. So, okay, so most of you are second language English. Is that, okay. So, all right, are there any native English speakers? We're really gonna other you now, hi, yeah, it's okay. All right, thank you very much. So, thank you all for being here. First of all, I know that the Perugia Journalism Festival is very competitive. There's a lot of panels and they're all amazing, so I really appreciate you guys being here. Little bit about me that you may know. I am Italian born, raised in Denmark, learned English there when I was 9, moved to the UK for university, been there 30 years. And for the past 22 years, I've been working in news for some of the biggest broadcasters in the world. Started at CNN as an intern, then the BBC as a researcher, eventually on air. Sky News, Channel 5, where I became the first second language English news anchor ever to present on British terrestrial television. And then Al Jazeera, which I joined in 2006 and left just last year. So because of my experience, over the years, quite a lot of young journalists approached me just for advice, because you do, don't you? And you should. I mean, it happens loads here in Perugia. And I think most more seasoned journalists do give younger journalists their time. And a lot of the journalists that would come and ask me for advice would be, I guess, in British terms, what you might term foreign. So they would tend to be people that were either working in international news or domestic news in the UK, but were not British or American or any of the native English-speaking nations, not Anglophones. And they would come and ask me for advice because I was, and still, remained up until I left, one of the few sort of audibly, I sound different now to what I sounded like 20 years ago, but you can still tell that I'm not a native English speaker. And so, I'd have chats with these journalists, because you do, and you say, look, it's about curiosity, and it's about tenacity, and it's about a little bit of luck, and it's about hard work. And then, I don't know when it happened, all of a sudden I thought, I'm just tired of lying to them. Because I was lying to them. Because sure, of course, it's about tenacity and hard work and curiosity and all of that, and thinking outside the box, and we know all of that. But the real question I wanted to ask them is, well, how's your English? And the real thing I meant by how's your English was, can you pass? Can you pass as a native English speaker? At least to an international audience, even if you don't totally fool a native English audience. Because ultimately, that was going to be not an unsurmountable obstacle, but a very big obstacle in any career, really in any career in journalism, and a very big obstacle when it came to broadcasting. And in a way, it was something I had the answer to within 30 seconds of any conversation. Now, I never told them it was impossible, because it isn't impossible, and I would never say that now. I was told when I first started my City University course, literally like week 2, you will never work for the BBC. And then I did work for the BBC. And then I was on air for the BBC. And then I got taken off air at the BBC because of my accent, but I still did it. So, it's never impossible, but it will make it harder. And so I've started doing, since I left Al Jazeera, quite a lot of work around this issue, which I think is crucial when we talk about diversity and inclusion. There's a few things, though, to distinguish. So one thing is language, and one thing is accent. And I think especially for native speakers, the two things get mixed up. Because actually, certainly in the UK, for example, there's a lot of regional accents, and it's quite recent that they started being included in national broadcasting. So it's always an issue. Even in Italy, there will be some regional accents, especially if they're particularly strong, and in the States, in every country. So accents always matter. So I'm going to start with focusing on language, because especially if, and this is the International Journalism Festival of Perugia, I'm guessing a lot of people here are interested in international broadcasting, or any kind of journalism, not just broadcasting. And language is our tool as journalists. You cannot compromise on your use of language. The kind of journalism that I think most of us aspire to do, most people would not be able to do in their own native language. So most Brits would not be able to broadcast live on the BBC News. Nothing against them, it's just, it's a skill that you acquire, but it is a skill. I think there's an issue there with the talk. Okay, great. So language is the tool, and it's non-negotiable. With the best will in the world, however inclusive you want to be, however much you're into diversity, and I think one of the good things that's happened in our industry over the past few years, in that actually diversity and inclusion has been started to be taken seriously, but you cannot compromise on language, because you cannot compromise on clarity, and that is the tool with which we communicate information to our audiences. And with the greatest of respect, if we fail at doing that, we have failed at doing our job in every aspect. Obviously, there are differences between, let's say, British or national broadcasting, so TV and radio in countries where English is the native language. Then there's newspapers, the printed word. Obviously, less pressure there than in broadcasting, but I would say still an issue. I mean, being able to write well, you can have the best exclusive in the world, but being able to write well and convey your thoughts is crucial. And then international broadcasting. And I'm going to start again just by focusing on international broadcasting because we're in Perugia. And I know that we are at the International Journalism Festival of Perugia, but after 22 years in news in some of the biggest broadcasters in the world, I would argue that there is no such thing as international journalism. There's no such thing as international news. There is English language news. And I'm not going to do the whole let's go around the room, but I think if I were to ask you, okay, think of what you would think of when it comes to international news. I think you'd think New York Times, Guardian, Economist, Financial Times. I think for Brits it's a bit weird because the BBC is the national broadcaster as well, but you would think the BBC World Service is massive. BBC World has now merged, but still a voice. You'd think CNN for CNN International. Interestingly, you'd think of Al Jazeera, but you'd think of Al Jazeera English. You wouldn't have thought of Al Jazeera before they launched an English channel. And so I think it's English language news. And it's not surprising that since language is so key in our job, that English language news is dominated by Anglophone, I don't want to say Anglo-Saxon, but Anglophone as in UK, US overwhelmingly, a bit of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, but mainly it's UK, US, dominated broadcasters or media companies, and within those newsrooms, dominated by native English speakers. Now, there's a real push in the US and the UK, again, I was mentioning before, for diversity. So I'm not saying that it's the same thing even within the native English speakers, but I am saying it's an issue and a part of diversity that often, the newsrooms will be blind to, because I tried calling and asking around, people don't even have the numbers. And I think a big way to ensure that newsrooms are more diverse in general for anything is to start getting the numbers, because when you got the figures, then you know what you're talking about. Now, is it bad that it's English language news? Well, English is the global language, and I think at this point no one's going to start learning Esperanto, so English is where we're at. There's 1.5 billion English speakers around the world. Of them, around 600 million are native English speakers. So actually, you're looking at about 1 billion people around the world that speak English as a second or a third language. So of course, it's the language of anything that we would call international journalism, but the truth is, it's the language of anything that we would call international. I mean, business, academia. I mean, I can tell you during COVID, so many, even on Al Jazeera, so many of the experts that I would speak to would come from English-speaking nations. We tried to broaden it out because, of course, COVID was having a different impact. But so even in academia, even in research, international politics, obviously, diplomacy, I mean, don't tell the French, but English is the main language, show business, social media, most things to do with tech. I know in social media you get bubbles, but let me tell you, Italian language Twitter and English language Twitter are very different things. And it's English language Twitter, at least as it was pre the revolution, that is really the global one. So English is absolutely the key that you need to unlock what we like to call our interconnected world. So English matters. And that's why, like I say, most people say, well, of course speaking English is an advantage. And I'm like, no, I want to use the words that we use now to describe various things. Because in this time and age, and it's good, again, it's like diversity and equality, we are aware of privilege. So you hear about, white privilege, heterosexual privilege, male privilege. And to me, speaking English is a privilege. It's a privilege for the people who speak it as a second and third language. And actually, they often, when they come from the developing world, often tend to come from a sort of socioeconomic privileged background. Because, if you're going to learn English to a certain level, you're not necessarily just going to learn it in school, and so you get additional lessons and all of that. But it's certainly a privilege to be a native English speaker. And the thing about privilege, we're always sort of, you always think about privilege, and what is often said is that if you have the privilege, you never see it. You're not aware of the privilege that you have because you have it. You're never disadvantaged by it. And I think a lot of that applies to the English language issue. Because I have spoken to a lot of people in my career and all the news, and between the BBC, CNN, Sky, Al Jazeera, I've been around, so I've met a lot of the people there. There is no desire to keep people out, but it's just an inability to see it. They just don't see it. And because they don't see it or recognize it as something that would affect their coverage, they don't deal with it. And here we get a little bit into the realm of accents. Like I said, language is the thing that's non-negotiable, and then accents play a part. And even in international networks, I sort of do the hierarchy that it's kind of like Australian, New Zealand, then a sort of neutral American, and then if you have like a posh but not too posh British accent, you've kind of won the jackpot of the English accent. And that will help you, and that will mean jobs. And I'll tell you what, there's so many people that I see on Twitter that will put it in their Twitter bio. And these are people that are so aware of privilege, but they will literally put, whatever, around the world with a British accent. Because even if it's subconscious, people realize that it is a privilege. We can get into a lot of reasons why that is. I'm sure some of it will be cultural, historical, but I think what it is now is that it's also seen as a kind of neutral, clear to understand accent. And because we're talking about accents, I'm just going to do a little bit about national broadcasting. I'm not going to focus on that too much because I think it's a slightly different issue. I will be plugging my newsletter repeatedly over the next few minutes. So there's more that I write there. But I do think the UK and the US have a slightly different dynamic because, of course, for them, the global language is the local language as well. I'll say two things to a lot of the journalists that always approach me and say, okay, I want to get into British broadcasting, but it's hard for me because I'm not a native Brit and blah, blah, blah. So I'll say two things. First of all, journalism is all about understanding the culture and your audience. And with the best will in the world, if you've just arrived in a country 3 years ago, the chances are you don't understand the culture, you don't really understand the audience, and you certainly don't understand the audience, in the UK's case, outside of London, because most people tend to live in the London bubble because that's where the jobs are. And the other thing that I would say, and this is national broadcasting, but it kind of overlaps, news is about trust. Trust is tribal. It just is. Think about it. Who do you trust? You trust your family, you trust your neighbors, you trust your immediate circle. And although not always, if you're stuck somewhere abroad and you meet someone from your own nation, chances are you're going to try and bond because you have some common ground. So when it comes to people with a foreign accent in national news, yes, I think it needs to be addressed. Yes, I think there's 14.5 million people in the UK who are foreign-born, and you never hear a foreign-born sounding accent on British TV, or very rarely in news, and I don't think that's right. But there are also other obstacles that go beyond, discrimination. I mean, I wouldn't even call it discrimination. I just think that there's issues there that need to be addressed. Okay, so let's go back to international news, which I think is probably the thing that interests most people here. Why does it matter? Why does it matter that, you know, international news is in English? I mean, look, you know, it's the common language. Most of us have figured out how to speak it in one way or another. Does it matter? Well, I think it does, because language is never about language. Language is a conduit for the cultures that it comes from. When I was 9 years old and I moved from Italy to Copenhagen and I went to a quote-unquote international school, which was a British and American curriculum, the only thing that was international was the students, I didn't learn a language, or at least I didn't just learn a language. I learned a culture. And I learned how to be in what we could describe the sort of Anglo-Saxon, Anglophone, you know, UK, US culture. And it's that, as much as speaking English, that helped me enormously when then I was a CNN intern, or I started at the BBC, or I went to Sky News. And it's about culture. So, because everyone who will speak English will share a narrative, will share the culture, obviously, I think that affects the narrative. And that's why Al Jazeera English was born. You know, back in 2006, I mean, Al Jazeera English now is almost mainstream, which makes me laugh because we were so much the outsiders back in 2006. But Al Jazeera English is very much born out of challenging what was seen as a cultural a narrative dominated by the UK and the US. It's not a coincidence that it launches in 2006. It's 5 years after 9/11. It's 3 years after the start of the war in Iraq. It's the height of the war on terror. Do you see what I mean? Al Jazeera, I mean, I don't think there is a Arab point of view. Obviously, there's many. But it was all about challenging what was seen as international news, but actually what seemed to follow a UK-US narrative. Look, I know that this is sort of complicated and potentially controversial and a lot to discuss. But certainly that was their aim, to challenge what they saw not as international journalism, but as sort of cultural influence over what was seen as international news. So if you're in Italy, you're learning about the Arab world by watching the BBC. And Al Jazeera said, no, if you're in Italy, you learn about the Arab world by watching Al Jazeera. And so they tried to get the sort of narrative back. But there's another story that I worked on, because actually I think that when it comes to Western and the sort of, you know, so-called Muslim world, a bit of a general term, but, you know, the sort of global South, I do think that in the 17, 18 years since Al Jazeera started, there have been a lot of changes, and I do think the voices of the global South are certainly, it's not perfect, but are certainly more heard. But as a Western, there was a story that I did that really made me realize how different the narratives were, and that was fascism. Which is obviously a word that we're hearing about a lot. And last year I presented here in Perugia a film that I made, Fascism in the Family, available on YouTube, little plug, where I talk about my grandfather, who was a fascist in Mussolini's regime. So I look at that history. And I look at the present. Obviously, you know that we have a right-wing government who are often accused of closing an eye to fascism, whatever you may think of that. I thought that there was a sort of link. And when the film came out, it was fascinating to see how different the reactions were to that film between Italian and continental Europeans in general on the one hand, and Brits and Americans on the other. It was fascinating, because if you think about it, they have very, very different views of World War II. Actually, views is the wrong word. They have very different experiences of World War II, because I think the view on World War II now is pretty unanimous. But very different experiences. Obviously, continental Europeans, either it was fascism or Nazism, or it was occupation, or it was invasion, or it was collaboration, or it was the deportation of your Jewish neighbors and any dissident. So they have one experience of that war. The UK and the US have a different one, because whereas continental Europe had to look itself in the mirror after the war and think, okay, where did we go wrong? How could this happen? The UK and the US, when it comes to World War II, were unquestioningly on the right side of history. I mean, look, they got there eventually, but, you know, looking at the issues, they really were. And even though the UK was bombed, it was never occupied. You know, it never had. They don't have a history of dictatorship, a recent one. And what I found very interesting with that film, and actually spurred a lot of the work I do now on language, is that I thought, well, gosh, you know, the rise of the far right and the problems with democracy and the appeal of dictatorships, which is growing, worryingly, is such a key story. And actually, the two cultures that sort of dominate or have overwhelming influence on what we call the global narrative are two of the cultures that actually don't share a recent history of dictatorship. And I find it very interesting on this particular topic. And I think that generally speaking, this is an example, but I think that if we truly are to have global media on this issue or any other issue, and we're here in Perugia, we've been talking loads about how media is changing, then I think we need to address the issue of language. I don't think it's going to be resolved anytime soon, but I do think that we need to raise awareness of it, and that maybe that would lead us to a sort of more, representative global media. I'm just going to end with a little bit of advice, I suppose, unsolicited maybe, but I do get approached by a lot of young journalists about this issue, and sometimes not so young. And I have to say, sometimes not just journalists, anyone that has to speak and use English as their tool. So I got 3 little bits of advice. One is psychological, one is about language, one is clarity. So psychological. Forgive me if this sounds patronizing, but I know what it's like to be the only person that sounds weird in a room where everybody sounds not weird. And by not weird, I mean native, and you rock up with an accent. You have nothing to apologize for. It's all about diversity, and all of us speak the way we speak for very valid reasons. We speak the way we speak because of the influences that have shaped us, because of our backgrounds. And actually, whenever I hear someone with a different accent, I think, okay, I'm gonna listen to them. I'm not gonna discriminate against everybody else. I'm just okay, I'm gonna listen to them because that person will have a different experience, and actually we probably see whatever issue we're talking about in a way that I, with the best will in the world, will not be able to see because I don't have that person's experience, which is kind of at the core of diversity and inclusion. So all I would say is, I know that sometimes, I don't know, maybe I'm speaking for myself, maybe you're there sitting there thinking, nah, I've never felt this way. But if you've ever felt awkward about not really your voice sounding different, just know that your voice matters because it sounds different. Second point is language, and there's no shortcuts here. Basically, language and accents are 2 different things. Non-negotiable, work on the language, work on the grammar, listen to lots of podcasts, listen to radio, especially if you live in a non-English speaking country. I mean, it may sound obvious, but I think sometimes people are insecure about their language, and then that also has an impact on how they communicate, but I think the language is the most important. The third bit I was gonna call accents, and I thought, no, I'm not gonna call it accents. I'm gonna call it clarity. Because an accent can be, I don't even want to say forgiven, an accent can be accepted, it should be welcomed, but let's say it could be accepted, but lack of clarity in journalism, but really in anything, cannot be accepted. So work on your clarity. If you need to, do try and get some voice coaching. My advice would be very clear with whoever it is that is coaching you, what you want the end result to be. Because I don't believe in trying to be something that you're not. And the vast majority of people will never, nor should they ever, sound American or British or Australian. The trick is to sound like you, to anchor your voice in some kind of British accent, so pick so you don't sound a little bit British one day, a little bit American, a bit Australian the next. But really, it's sounding like you. And I remember that when I started my career, some editor, so long ago now, I forget, but someone said, in any broadcasting career, for any broadcaster, you will spend the first 3 years of your career trying to sound like what you think you should sound like. So, hello, I'm doing the news, I am very serious, and I have authority. And then you're gonna spend the rest of your career trying to sound like you. And I think that that is good advice in broadcasting in general, and specifically for second language English speakers. By all means, work on the clarity. I work a lot on my speed. I don't think I've ever gone on air without doing crazy tongue twisters just before starting. Everyone in the newsroom thought I was mad, and then I have this crazy thing called a bone prop that you shove between your teeth anyway, because it also gave me security, and I've done a lot of voice training. I did not sound 20 years ago like I sound now, and I'm definitely a better broadcaster. So that would be my tips. And finally, before we go to questions, a few weeks ago, I was in London and I was just having a coffee with, again, a young journalist that got in touch because they're also not from an English background, working in the UK, doing really well in one of the main newsrooms. And we were having a chat, and then 10 minutes in, they start crying. And I don't think it was anything I said. I think it was more about the things that they'd been going through, which weren't horrific, It wasn't like bullying or anything. It was just a generally feeling othered. and also feeling that it didn't really matter what you did, you're always going to have this massive obstacle that was going to impede your career. So I'll end on a slightly, upbeat, advicey note. I think there's a lot of changes happening in our industry, as we all know, and I think even when it comes to this, changes are happening. I mean, I have an obsessive eye and ear to foreign voices, and there's a few that are popping up on the horizon. And so I think things are changing in our favor. Generally speaking, the advice is always work on your weaknesses, and as second language English speakers, our English will be a weakness, work on it, and play to your strengths, and veering away from the journalism voice and just generic life advice. I think life is a series of sliding doors, and frankly, in my 20-plus year career, I've noticed that ultimately, by and large, the people that have passion and the people that work hard and the people that maybe also have a little bit of luck but that really persevere do eventually find a place for themselves, although it's not often the place where they expected it to be. So good luck, and thank you. Great. Well, I'm all alone, so I guess I'm doing the Q&A then. Okay, so this is where I hope lots of people put their hands up. Okay, there's a hand up there, please. And then, so first the lady at the back, and then you, sir, at the front.
Thank you. Hi. You have spoken a lot about language and accents. In my experience, a lot of people don't even get that far. So obviously you've worked a lot and you've been very lucky, and I'm sure you've earned everything that you've done and accomplished. But have you found maybe towards the beginning of your career that people would kind of judge you based on your name sounding very Italian before even reading or listening to what you have to say?
It's hard to know, because at the very, very beginning of my career, I think I was so low down the pecking order that no one really even noticed me. I do remember, though, being sent to make a cup of tea for the BBC regional radio breakfast program, and I didn't know how to make tea because I came from Denmark, and so I made it with one tea bag and they sent it back. And I remember being mortified. So, look, I think sometimes people overlook you, right? And again, I have never noticed nastiness. I don't think it's done on purpose. I don't think people are sitting there going, let's push the foreigner to one side. But I do think it ties in a lot with how much do you know the UK. And so if you're in a newsroom and someone has literally just arrived, 2 years ago, maybe you're not going to send them to, I don't know, some strike in a town in the north where they literally have never set foot before. So does it happen? Yeah, but I think it happens. I'm sure lots of other people have been overlooked for a million other reasons. I think sometimes you get othered. It's not so much the overlooked. There have been a million silly comments that I've had, but I think in fairness, they were not mean, they weren't nasty, it was kind of well-meaning. But the girl that burst into tears a few weeks ago, it was someone commenting on her name and the way she pronounced her name. So, but it didn't come from a place of trying to other, but sometimes it just happens anyway. Thank you for your question. And I think it was the gentleman at the front, and then,
Hi, thank you so much. That I really liked it, and I felt seen in every single sentence that you said. I wanted to ask you 2 questions quickly, based a little bit on my experience. I come from Southern Europe, from Spain, and I work in English. I make videos on TikTok in English. I've often faced situations in which my accent, because of being a Spanish accent, was seen more foreign than other accents from Northern Europe. So everyone sounded, like German speaking English, that was okay. But if it was a Spanish person speaking English, it was like, oh, he has an accent. So I wanted to know if you've ever faced that kind of situations or what you think about that.
So I was always the only foreigner. So at least I wasn't competing with other strange sounding accents. And mine always sounded weird because, I learned. And the thing is, this is key. A lot of people who speak English as a second language don't learn it in an English speaking nation. So then you come out with that weird transatlantic international school English, which means you literally fit nowhere. So I've never had that experience. This is what I would suggest. Question it. Go to the bosses and say, okay, and also be very clear and say, look, I would like to pursue a career, even being on social media is basically being on air, right? You're using your voice, it's you and whatever. So I would say, go go to a boss and say, don't pretend it doesn't matter. That's what's driving me crazy in newsrooms now. And, because I'm not a spring chicken anymore, a lot of my peers are, editors in other newsrooms. And so I have very honest conversations, and they know what I went through, because I would cry with them over a beer, 20 years ago about everything that was happening. But they just don't see it. So I would say, question it and say, don't even make it aggressive, like it's not why is the German on and the Spaniard isn't. But you could just say, I know I have an accent. I would like to work on it. What do you suggest I do? Is there any training that I could do? But I would say, especially if you're speaking to someone who's a native English speaker, so British or American, chances are they're not going to have a clue. Chances are that they will be quite timid because they don't want to offend you. I mean, remember that nothing like the way we speak is actually as linked to who we are. So the potential to be offensive is huge. But unfortunately, that potential to be offensive is kind of masking any possibility of dealing with the issue and actually becoming more inclusive, because you're actually helping people do it, right? So I would challenge it in a sort of friendly Southern European way that they would like,
So the second question was, do you think social media formats are more friendly towards people with accents? In my experience, when I tried to work on TV, it was like no way, you're not gonna do it. But social media, people are much more open to that, also because they see it more. What's your opinion about
Possibly. It's not my field, but I would guess yes. Well, first of all, because you have more options on social media than you do on telly. I mean, TV is fiercely competitive to get on anywhere for anybody, regardless of what you sound like, right? And the stakes are higher. There's a lot more money. They do a lot more focus groups. Tends to be an older audience. If you're in TV news, any day could be your 9/11. Any day is a day that changes the world, and you need, so this is the word, you need people with authority, right? So on TV, you need more people with authority, news, right? News and current affairs. Then sometimes you do on social media, because by the nature of social media, you're appealing to a younger audience and all of that. So I can definitely see that there's differences, but it's all about basically you being happy with your product and people being able to understand you. And I think you sound perfect, but you know what I mean? Anything that you would not be happy with, I'd say take it to the editor. But if they're like some British guy who only speaks one language, then maybe ask someone else as well. Any other questions? There's a question at the back.
So thank you so much for the speech. It's been really interesting and really relatable. I wanted to add, so you've been talking about how accents tell a lot about not only, where you come from or where you live, but they can also be telling in terms of your kind of social-economic background. So I wanted to ask, kind of given your experience, what role does class also play into this context and in relation to accents?
So I think, class obviously plays a huge part when we're talking about accents, let's say in a national setting, so like the UK or any other country. When it comes to foreign accents, I don't think it plays a part. So I think sounding foreign is sounding foreign. What you get is that in a lot of, say in Italy, but anywhere, there's a lot of people that are aware that English matters. And so you will send your kids to the international school, or they will have special English lessons, because apparently, this is what I'm told, but English lessons aren't that great in Italian schools. But, or they will do 2 weeks at some Oxford school, summer school, whatever, or they'll have a specific tutor. So then it starts to matter. And I remember, being really aware when, Al Jazeera English was all about talking to the global south. And in fairness, I have to say, I don't work for them anymore, not to blow a trumpet, but we really did do that. We got different voices. But sometimes you were aware that obviously the people that you were talking to, if you're talking in a very poor country and they come with an accented but clear and good English, of course they come from a good socioeconomic, or, it's not of course, but 99% they come from a socioeconomic background that's solid. Now, you're still getting the view from that country. You just have to be aware, A, that no one is ever a spokesperson for their whole country, but that B, obviously, if you're a parent, what's the thing you're going to invest in for your kids? Education and focus on English. So that's where I think the socioeconomic thing plays in.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Ok. Anche domande in italiano, se ci sono. Scusate che ho fatto tutto in inglese.
Non parlo italiano.
No, that's fine. Not you necessarily. I don't expect that level of bilingualism. Yeah.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts on maybe comparing yourself against yourself in your first language, and how your work is in, let's say, Italian against to how your work is in English as a second language.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a lot, because I actually work in both. So I write in both, I broadcast in both, I broadcast live in both. So talking about privilege, I am very privileged that I learned English when I was 9 years old. So yes, I learned it outside of a native English-speaking language. Yes, it's kind of my accent is here, there, and everywhere, but it was my dominant language from the age of 9. So I was used to studying in English, reading in English. You know, my friends were in English, the movies, the songs that we danced to at school were in English, so it was very much part of my world. So ironically, even though Italian is absolutely my mother tongue, English has been my dominant language for 40 years, right? Since I moved. So then the weaker language, ironically, is Italian. And it, you know, so whenever I'm talking about specific subjects, so let's say I'm talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when I started talking about that in Italian media, I very much looked up how they said things like the West Bank or settlements, because those words are not obvious to translate. So I think working in two languages, especially in news, and that's why anyone who works in news, that's why be obsessive about listening to radio, especially in podcasts, because there's certain phrases, there's certain words that crop up the whole time. A lot of them will be cliches. I'm not saying you need to cut and paste, but you need to be aware of them. All I'll say is that I'm writing, whenever I write, certainly when I write in Italian, not so much when I write in English, I cannot write in Italian if I don't have an online Italian-English dictionary. But even in English, because sometimes there'll be phrases that I want to express, whatever I'm trying to express in Italian works best, and then I try to cobble it together in English, and then vice versa. But so that's my experience, but again, I have the privilege of having learned it when I was little. Anybody else? Any Italians who felt, oh, there's one at the back?
Should I ask in Italian or English?
Whichever one you're most comfortable with.
Either way, I think English is the most
I think we might as well go with English at this point,
yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned that if there's a candidate, like someone's asking for a job and then he's applying for a job, and like they've lived in a country only for 3 years, they most likely don't know the culture so well. So there's always going to be a better candidate in that country.
I think it depends what the job is. I think if it's a starting position, that's not necessarily the case. So when I started at BBC London, I'd done uni, but I'd still only been in the UK 5 years, and I'd never really left London. But I started, so I think it matters for some of the higher positions. And so what you get a lot is people that are journalists in other countries that then come to the UK and try to get an equivalent job. So I think that's when it matters. The advice that I would give is that, you know, national domestic journalism is all about tuning into what people are feeling, what people are thinking, you know, what they know, what they don't know as well. So I'm not sure that there's always going to be a better candidate. Look, like I was saying, passion counts for a lot, you know, and the killer line I always come out with whenever I feel it, you know, I always say, well, I'm here because I love this country and because I chose to be here. You're all here because you were born here when I'm in the UK. So there's a lot to be said for that. And, you know, Brexit is a big deal. I don't know if, maybe you're Italian, so you have a European background. I mean, there's a 5 million strong European community in the UK post-Brexit that's not having the best time. So I think, again, be aware of your weaknesses, work to your strengths. I'm not sure, you know, newsrooms are about the whole, right? So maybe they wouldn't pick you to be the North of England correspondent first time round. But I did a stint in the west of England. I mean, it was terrible, but I was sent there for 3 weeks. So, you know, that is a possibility as well. So no, I don't think you should think like that. I don't think you should ever think that it's an unsurmountable barrier, but be aware of it, right? And play to your strengths.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we're almost out of time. Any other questions? Oh, there's one up here. How much time do we have?
Hi.
Hey.
So you mentioned earlier that you got an MA in journalism at City University, and well, I'm Italian from my accent, you probably can tell, and I'm going to pursue an MA in journalism in the UK in September. And I was wondering if you think getting an MA in the UK helped you to level up with the competition.
Hugely. It was like, and I don't like the concept. I don't think, because, you know, I'm not going to stick the knife into City. I mean, all these journalism courses cost a lot of money. And we're talking about linguistic diversity, but actually socioeconomic diversity is a massive issue. I mean, I'm just focusing on something else, but, and if you have to shell out God knows how much for a course like that, and it's not just City, it's not just in England, it's in the UK as well, it's everywhere, then that impacts the diversity of your newsroom, especially when there's a cost of living crisis going on everywhere. Having said all that, yes, I did do it. Yes, it was an amazing calling card. What it meant was that when I then knocked on the door at the BBC and whatever, I mean, bear in mind, this is a million years ago, right? I finished in 1999, literally another millennium ago. So they just knew that I had learned the basics. And I think because they couldn't check my school, you know, like, I mean, actually, no, I'd gone to uni in the UK, but, you know, they couldn't suss me out. They couldn't think, but when they saw City, they knew that at least I knew enough about the UK to have been accepted at City. And I did the broadcast one, which was meant for Brits. So I was literally one of two foreigners, although I was the sort of one that sounded foreign. Whereas usually all the foreigners do the international masters. So no, it's absolutely worth doing. I do quite a lot of work at City, and I've spoken, I did a podcast with them about this very issue. I just think, yeah, it just needs to be discussed. People just need to be aware, right? Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Guys, thank you so much for coming. I will now plug the newsletter, so don't move. So it's news with a foreign accent. It's on Substack, and I am writing about this a lot. And all I'll say is that people should just be aware of it, you know? I'm not saying that newsrooms need to change everything, but I think awareness is important. So if you could help me in raising that awareness, you don't have to do anything, you know, public posts or whatever, but just talking among yourselves. Feel free to share the newsletter, but also just feel free to raise it as an issue. Thank you.